Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine put together by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Tertiumquids.org is our website, and we keep an archive of all these programs online at our YouTube channel, Freedom and Prosperity Radio. You can also find out more about joining in our quest, and we continue to work even with a different General Assembly than we've had in many, many years. Our policy efforts, white papers, and work with the Tuesday Morning Group Coalition. Find out more about all of that at tertiumquids.org. Certainly many other things going through the Virginia General Assembly, but the Second Amendment and firearms are the biggest right now, and they're dominating the conversation. And kicking off this week's program is Legislative Counsel for Gun Owners of America, Michael Hammond. Good morning, Michael. How are you? Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Joe. Good morning, Virginia.
So we have this dichotomy of an attitude in the General Assembly regarding the Second Amendment and firearms, and then what I'm seeing across the Commonwealth, over hundreds of communities declaring Second Amendment sanctuary legislation, voting it in. Even Virginia Beach, I guess, adding new meaning to hashtag VB Strong. Even the very place where Ralph Northam is pointing to and saying this is why we have to do all these things. Arguably, none of the
Not
bills
to mention Fairfax County, where people are turning out in massive numbers in order to protest what supposedly would play nowhere else in Virginia except for Fairfax County.
Is that important? And I wanted to get there to that because I feel like the Democrats are committing political suicide and perhaps just figuring, well, we only have one session or two where we're going to hold the majority after this, so we're just going to make it count because I can't really make heads or tails out of it because as elected representatives, when you see rooms full of people that can't all be Republicans, Democrats got to be able to do a nose count, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. Well, first of all, look at how we got here. Basically, a New York billionaire, a guy worth $50 billion, decided he would come and buy Virginia.
Yep.
He spent who knows how many hundreds of millions of dollars in the process. It's sort of not the culmination, but the centerpiece of a larger effort to buy the United States and rip up the Constitution. But this New York billionaire, and his name is Michael Bloomberg, spent an enormous amount of money, created a computer program that fed in every piece of data that was capable of being purchased. It's something which you couldn't do if you were worth less than $50 billion. And on the basis of this, he took a Virginia General Assembly, which is already sort of narrowly divided, and narrowly bought it. And when I say narrowly, if 5,000 votes had switched in certain districts, the General Assembly would still be in Republican hands. So he spent an enormous amount of money, bought 5,000 carefully targeted votes, and is now going around and using this for the proposition that Virginia has now become either a purple or a blue state. It hasn't, as the massive crowds that have turned out in every part of the state to protest these gun control measures have demonstrated. And it's interesting. I mean, they turn out. The State Senator Marsden, who was, I think, chairing one of these hearings, perhaps in Fairfax County, leaned over and in an open mic moment said, these people are crazy. If we just don't respond, it will all blow over. So that's a general notion. The people of the Commonwealth of Virginia are not smart enough to rule themselves, absent the help of a billionaire New Yorker. And at this point, the only exercise is to sort of conceal the ultimate objectives which the leftists who took control of the General Assembly have, and hope that they can slam it down everyone's throat.
But the fealty, I think, is where they're going. Is once we're unarmed and unable and actually discouraged on even defending yourself, then we will have no other choice but then to see the common sense, and I'll put that in air quotes, implicitly, of bigger and bigger government, bigger and bigger nanny state.
Yeah.
Bloomberg began his message, albeit laughably, when there was some shootings in New York, and claimed that he knew that all the guns in New York were coming from Virginia, and he has just ridden that wave. But let's go to Marsden's open mic comment, because we've had similar ones in Central Virginia where supervisors have complained out loud. Who are these people? They're not even the voting majority. And I guess, as you pointed out, the purchase of those 5,000 votes, and we have some amazing numbers. Scott Sorovel was trying to get a Transparency Act where some of these delegates and senators would have to disclose those last-minute rides of the ad buys. We're seeing final week before the election, $50,000, $100,000 ad buys going in to just, I guess, paper the TV and
that's
radio.
That's the Bloomberg model. He did that in 2018. He essentially bought the United States House of Representatives. It turns out, I did an article on this, and if you'd switched about 50, I think it's 54,543 votes, but about 54,000 votes in the districts which went narrowly Democrat. The U.S. House of Representatives would still be in Republican hands. But the other thing, as you have just pointed out, is that Bloomberg did most of his media drops after the final filing.
Yep.
And so they basically wouldn't turn up before the elections, and so you had all of this money going in to buy elections in places like Pennsylvania, and the money was spent deliberately and fraudulently to avoid any reporting, any transparency.
We're visiting with Michael Hammond. He's the Legislative Counsel for Gun Owners for America on this week's Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Michael, at the end of this, and there's a great quote, and it's a famous YouTube viral video of Delegate Nick Freitas, who, thank goodness, isn't one of those we lost in the Virginia General Assembly this year, holding up one of the most true statements I've ever heard about a progressive, and that goes for Republicans and Democrats. And he says, when the policy fails to deliver the results you've promised your constituents, you'll be back looking for more reasons to restrict our Second Amendment rights. And I've extrapolated that because I think the same could be true about a lot of things big government statists try to do. We'll fix education, we'll fix health care, but in this particular case, none of these bills, outside of some of these background check legislations and red flag laws, are going to have the impact they promise. And the red flag ones are going to have worse impact because you're going to have people scooped up without the right of a trial, without the right to defend themselves or confront those accusing them, and a rapid response team set aside with $250,000 to go enforce these red flag laws as soon as somebody says, "Hey, there's a commie over there,"
my neighbor's a Jew.
Yeah, exactly.
Come and take him away. Yeah, I mean we've seen this whole prototype before. Back in the 1940s, see a Jew, report a Jew.
Yeah, absolutely.
Basically, how'd that work out?
Well, do we want to be those people? I mean, that's what I'm afraid of. Is that's what we're going to be?
That's the way it's going. I mean, we have the experience. They rapidly passed it in liberal states, by and large, with the exception of Florida. They and I don't call them I call them red flag gun confiscation laws, or gun confiscation order laws, because that's where they are. We understand what will happen because it's already happened in places like Maryland. The SWAT team shows up in the case of Maryland, 5:17 in the morning. They come to the house in that case, of a guy named Gary Willis, a black man, and the police shoot him to death.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect that's going to happen a lot. And once it begins to happen, of course, it'll be too late to do anything about it. In Maryland, when a black man was shot to death, a 62-year-old black man who was described by every neighbor and every relative as a very gentle man who wouldn't hurt a flea, but had a aunt or uncle who didn't like his politics. So they dropped a dime on him.
Mm-hmm.
The SWAT team showed up in the middle of the night, and they shot him to death. I'm guessing that's going to happen a lot more as this thing goes on. The other thing we know, of course, is once they take your guns, they say, well, when we take your guns without giving you an opportunity to be heard, there will be a hearing somewhere down the line. Well, that seldom happens. We know from Florida that 90% of the people who contest the fact that their guns have been confiscated don't have attorneys. They certainly don't have government-provided attorneys. And in those few cases in which they establish that the government had no case and that the complaint against them was bogus,
mm-hmm.
it takes up to 9 months or more for them to get their confiscated property returned. And so we understand. We have seen the way these things work. They're sort of the answer to the question, what would Hitler do under the same circumstances?
Mm-hmm.
And the only way they pass them is, A, they have the wholly owned media, which refuses to say anything bad about middle-of-the-night SWAT team raids.
No, of course
and they simply sugarcoat them in these sweet words like, "Oh, red flag loss."
Yeah.
So
they accept the narrative.
We're fighting very hard. It's certainly part of a three-part effort to massively confiscate guns in Virginia. First of all, they make them illegal, probably illegal retroactively. Secondly, they have the middle-of-the-night raids. And third of all, they have these universal background checks, which what they do is they produce a form, which is called a 4473, normally held by a dealer, but we know that in recent years, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms has come around in connection with its annual inspection and photographed all the dealers' forms. Notwithstanding the fact, not only is that illegal, it's illegal because of a law I wrote. So they illegally photograph these forms, and what they have in effect is a National Gun Registry, a list of homes to which they go once they have outlawed semi-automatic firearms.
It doesn't make a single soul safer. It doesn't even, come to the level of even addressing the Virginia Beach shooting. So what is the response, Michael, of some of the, and I was reading a piece, the press has been gobbling up the idea that some of the members of the Virginia General Assembly, like Cree Deeds, are facing a lot of heat in their districts because they're rural. Why, when Cree Deeds ran for governor in 2009, he was actually endorsed by the NRA over the Republican candidate for governor. So how are these, and are there enough swing votes amongst old school, maybe Democrats in Virginia's?
I think so. That's what the big fight is going to be about. The Senate, a flip of one vote, and all this stuff would die. The House, a flip of a couple of votes. And so it is eminently doable if we fight very, very hard and very, very smart. And so at this point, that's exactly what we're doing. We're trying to put forth the effort and the targeted effort to ensure that these red state Democrats understand that they can either represent their constituents or alternatively they can lose their seats.
Let me ask you this, Michael. Michael Hammond, Legislative Counsel, Gun Owners for America on here, and you can find out more about them at gunowners.org. You mentioned comprehensive background checks, and it's the comprehensive background checks. That's all. How could you be against 75% of Virginians prefer background checks when what they don't realize is less than 5% of all gun transactions in Virginia take place without a background check already.
Yeah, exactly.
And none of the cities...
Actually, even the New York Times did an article on that in which they explained what was wrong with those crazy surveys, which purport to show that 93% of all North Dakotans want universal background checks. And yet, basically, when you go to North Dakota, they threw out their United States senator, a conservative Democrat, based on universal background checks. And so what's the deal with these bogus surveys? The answer is even the New York Times understands is that most people have either purchased their guns through dealers, or alternatively, everyone they know has purchased a gun through a dealer.
Right.
And so when someone calls them up on the phone and asks them, do you support universal background checks, what they're thinking is they're answering the question, do I support the status quo? Do I like the way things are? Do I oppose any efforts to liberalize gun control?
Mm-hmm.
That's what people think they're saying. In fact, what their interpreter is saying is we want a massively expanded prohibition on even handing your gun to another person without the government's permission.
Mm.
If you look at the Virginia Universal Background Check law, it is so full of these weaselly word holes that, for instance, you're standing in your living room. You've just bought a new gun. You want to show it to your neighbor. You hand it to him, and you step out of the room to go to the bathroom. You're a felon.
Yep, absolutely. And Michael Hammond, one last one for you, because I feel like, and I bore this testimony, that we're in a place where we're establishing a guilty until proven innocent society here in the United States. And certainly there are many other countries constituted that way, and I think our statist elected officials and bureaucrats would love a country where they get to decide. Governor Northam's State of the Commonwealth address was perhaps one of the greatest treatises in technocracy, and I'll help you do this and I'll tell you if you can do that nonsense, but it's anathema to the way the United States is. Is that, that shadow band you're talking about? Well, you don't want to own guns because it's so dangerous. You don't want to speak out. You don't want to have free speech because it's very dangerous. Is in lieu of actually amending the Constitution to change it to what they want, is that the agenda, is to get us to give up our privacy and our property ownership? You don't want to own property because we're going to protest out in front of your house until you give it up anyway. So you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. Certainly it would be very easy for the people who hate the Constitution and hate the Second Amendment particularly. It'd be very easy for them if they could scare people out of owning firearms. Mm-hmm. If not, I think they intend to use the same Bloomberg-created program they did in Virginia in 5 target states to try to take over the White House, the Senate, and the House in Washington, D.C. If they do that, they'll simply amend the Constitution through judicial fiat, perhaps by packing and expanding the court. Yeah. So there are a lot of ways by which this country can be turned into something other than a republic. And believe me, the left is working on all of them.
Oh, I know.
But certainly, if it could get us to voluntarily relinquish all of our rights, that would be very convenient.
Is this, and it's been mentioned to me that, we'll fight it in the courts and Trump's got all these, judges, it'll be deemed unconstitutional. But my argument against that, and I believe in that's the system, how it's supposed to work. But if that was the case, wouldn't they have done this in New York or Maryland or Illinois?
We've tried, believe me. And in most of the courts, even Trump and Bush and Bush selected judges are very, very loath to overturn state laws based on the Second Amendment. I mean, since Heller, at the point the Supreme Court in 2008, I think it was, decided that in its infinite wisdom, the Second Amendment was an individual right, not just the right of a state to create a militia. I said, basically what this is an invitation for us to spend the rest of our lifetimes battling the issue out inch by inch in the federal courts, and federal courts which are frequently consist of politicized judges appointed by people who were presidents who were certainly not conservative, to say the least. So the courts have very, very seldom overturned state laws, no matter how extreme they were, based on the Second Amendment. And to rely on the courts, even the courts as they're currently constituted, to save us from our laziness with respect to legislation is just the height of foolishness.
And Virginia had a huge voter turnout. I know you're not an election expert, but I believe the answer is in the 45 or 50% that didn't turn out. We had a huge turnout. Michael Bloomberg threw a bag of money. You mentioned 5,000 votes. Yet still, the highest turnout in the Commonwealth was in Rob Bell's district, the 58th, and it was a 52% voter turnout. So is the answer to turn these seats back over in people who don't think it's important, and maybe they're waking up in this General Assembly and realizing that it is important, and maybe we'll see even higher turnouts the next time the General Assembly is up for election?
Well, I sat down with a election expert for lunch yesterday, and it's sort of the beginning of our looking at what went wrong in Virginia and how we can change it. And as I said, I wrote an article saying that the U.S. House was turned blue by 54,000 votes. The Virginia General Assembly was turned blue by 5,000 votes. So that's certainly not an unattainable target if our people understand that this is Armageddon, that basically the 2020 elections, if we lose them in the same sense that we lost the Virginia General Assembly this past year, if we lose them, then we may have a difficult time holding on to our Second Amendment rights. As a matter of fact, we may have an impossible time holding on to our Second Amendment rights. So now is the time to begin looking at what we need to do to surmount what is not an enormous obstacle, an obstacle of 5,000 votes. What we need to do in order to turn that around. I think it's eminently doable, but we have to think about it, and we have to make our people understand how centrally important this is.
Michael, thank you so much for your efforts on that behalf. Again, it's gunowners.org, the Legislative Council for Gun Owners of America, a man who's written law, who's stood there and done exactly what we're trying to do here and make legislators see beyond their next polling data. And I appreciate everything you do, and you have a marvelous weekend, and we'll probably chat again before the General Assembly is over.
Sounds great.
Coming up next, we're going to visit with Scott Cosenza, legal affairs editor with Liberty Nation, on the legislators and their attempts to not only circumvent the Constitution and the Second Amendment, but the Fourth and the First. Coming up on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.